So for this lecture, we're going to be talking about power and politics within various cultural systems. We kind of talked a little bit about this stuff before when we looked at different social organization systems like bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. We'll talk a little bit more about those today and kind of how does power or how is power used within different cultures to kind of create more social cohesion within a culture as a whole. So coming from kind of Aristotle's work in philosophy, he talks about humans being, quote, the political animal. So in essence, we as humans and develop cultures, so we are in fact social creatures. And society can be organizationally very simple or very complex, right? We could be looking at a very small tribal level society down in Central America or down in the rainforest, or we could be looking at a large, complex state level society, whether we're looking at the United States, Europe, or China. We as creatures are forming governing systems based off of cultural mores or cultural morals. And power is actively manipulated through the use of political systems, both internally and externally. So kind of going along with the idea that humans themselves are political animals, I throw this graphic up here primarily because it is an election year, and we will be, hopefully conducting elections in November here. And, you sometimes see these words thrown around in reference to certain candidates, like the dark horse candidate who fights for change, the young Turk candidate who fights for ethics and reform, or the gerrymandering candidate who's looking to redraw political voting maps, and so forth, right? So we kind of have these different categorizations for the different priorities that some of our politicians may or may not have. So what we're really referring to here is in terms of how does power run through a particular society, right? And power can really be defined as the potential or ability to affect change through action or threat, right? Power can be either individual, you could have individual power, or it could be institutional. You could have a cultural institution that affords you power. And power is given by consent, right? You actually have to, it's the people you are exerting power over must consent to that power or the recognition of said power before you can actually have power in and of itself. So power can be defined in a variety of different ways, or the manifestation or kind of the expression of power can come in a variety of different ways, whether we are looking at, on this slide, the kind of anti-oil pipeline activists, or whether we're looking at the next slide, which is a neo-Nazi rally, right? These are different forms in which power manifests itself throughout our culture. So studying power in and of itself really arose off of the back of kind of political anthropology, which arose out of World War II, and really in the hopes of explaining why or how there was this rise in Nazism. One of the earlier political anthropologists was E. Evans Pritchard. So along with studying kind of the religious practices of the New Era, he also studied the political organization, right? And he found that the New Era was still run by big man leadership, although they had a population of well over 200,000. So this is kind of the issue of, we say that kind of complexity is a function of population size, but at the same time we say that it's not, right? Because you can have large-scale human populations without having particularly complex political leadership. So later, amongst kind of in the same study, he focused on witchcraft and magic amongst the Azande people, which live in relative proximity to the New Era. So the questions we'll kind of be dealing with during this recorded lecture is how did political systems form? What is considered a state? How do people, whether individually or institutionally, manipulate the use of power? And what role does globalization play in the manipulation and use of power worldwide and within individual cultures? So if we look at kind of how humans organize, we do have a political anthropologist named Elman Service, and I think we've already covered a little bit of this in terms of social organization. But he created a classification system to propose that human societies move from simple to complex and increasing integration, right? So remember, Service's system goes from bands to tribes to chiefdoms to states, and we'll briefly cover each of these again. So in terms of political organization and economy, these are the general patterns that we see. In a band level, there's reciprocal exchanges, but very little division of labor. Same thing with a tribal level system. As soon as you get to chiefdoms and states, on the other hand, there's either a redistribution via tribute or a redistribution via progressive tax structures. So you start to see that there actually is large and many, many, many divisions of labor once you get to chiefdoms and states as well. In terms of membership and settlement patterns, with our bands, of course, being the smallest, they're highly mobile. They generally don't live in fixed villages. There's a few dozen and up. But once you get up to kind of your chiefdom and state level societies, or when you have a few thousand or in tens of thousands, and you live in either lots of fixed villages or cities, townships, pretty much what we're familiar with in our state level society. And then in terms of levels of political organization, in terms of government and bands, you're kind of relatively egalitarian with very little bureaucracy. In tribal level societies, you either run by egalitarian or big man leadership, which is what we saw with the E.E. Evans Pritchard's work with the newer. Essentially, there was a decision-making individual in each village, but that position was not hereditary, nor was it a lifelong position. It was basically based off of kind of personal prowess and level of charisma. Once we get to chiefdoms and states, there's a lot of centralized, whether it's heredity or whether it's elected, kind of centralized leadership, and there are many, many levels of bureaucracy. So we kind of talked about this last time a little bit when we talked about economy, but we'll go over it real briefly again. So egalitarianism is kind of this notion of sharing resources equally amongst a group of people, right? It's usually seen in hunter-gatherer societies where the responsibility of resource acquisition is shared among all members of the group, right? But there can also be subsystems of egalitarianism within a culture which is not egalitarian. Essentially, we see this generally in state-level societies. The example that your book uses is the communal property rights and living organization that we see amongst the Amish and the Hutterites. So in terms of big man leadership, which is something that we see in a lot of band and tribal level societies, it usually takes a leadership role in negotiation of trade. If we look at an example, the Avalon of Melanesia, the big man is responsible for organizing those trade feasts that we talked about a little bit in the last lecture, the Kula expeditions. The normal individuals are bound by kin and affine trade, but do not coordinate the main trade feast or expedition. That's solely the responsibility of the big man. Big men may also have special ritual knowledge. In the Avalon, in Micronesia, or Melanesia rather, the big men know the special magic songs that make their yams go really large, right? In the bottom right corner here, you see a photo of kind of some of these yams, right? And these are not like the yams that you buy in the grocery store. They're very, very large, and generally can feed you for up to a week. So in essence, he who is kind of the best farmer, he who is kind of the best agriculturalist tends to become the big man, right? Because he is assumed to have special knowledge which allows his yams to grow very large. So in essence, what we're looking at in terms of big man leadership, there's some attribute, there's some feature of charisma that individual kind of contains that draws people to them, then that causes other people to look to them in terms of decision making. The power of a big man or the political authority of big men is generally shown through some sort of totem per se, or some sort of object. In the Avalon, we see that they use kind of a small handcrafted human totem, which is kind of a symbol of both power and the symbol of the office in which the individual holds. So in terms of the features of our big men leadership, that is entirely decentralized. They have some authority over certain activities, usually hunting. They are a possible ritual specialist or possibly have special ritual knowledge. The position itself is not heritable, so the children of the big men don't necessarily become big men themselves. It's a form of achieved status, right? This is status that you earn over a lifetime, right? And generally, in an anthropological sense, we say that women are not big men except on the island of Vinatanai, right, which is an island that doesn't have distinct concepts on gender, right? So whether we're looking at our Yanomami man here in the bottom right, or we're looking at one of our Micronesian Trobriand Islanders, big men leadership is kind of a central feature in both of those societies. So if we look at informal leadership, we actually see this a lot in different Yanomami and Brazilian Amazonian groups. It's called episodic leadership or informal leadership. It's found only in hunter-gathering groups. The leadership was chosen in the moment based on who was best suited to lead that particular activity. So an example of this would be if you're a very good hunter, you would be chosen as the leader in that moment because your group is about to go on a hunting expedition. So let's look at some bands. The general population size is 25 to 50. Hunter-gatherers is their economic organization, living strictly off of wild foods. Sometimes we see generalized reciprocity as an economy. The political organization is non-centralized egalitarianism. And some examples of this would be the Inuit people of the American Northwest, the Wogeo of Southeast Asia, the Kung of Africa, and the Dobe of Africa as well. So this is just showing you some Inuit tribal members. This is a picture of a young man and woman from the Wogeo tribe in Southeast Asia. This is a picture of the Kung Bushmen of Central South Africa. This is actually a very large group that still is in existence today and actually has some fairly decent political organization on a state level that we'll kind of talk about here in a little bit. In terms of your tribes, your population size is from hundreds to thousands. They're either pastoralist or horticulturist. They're either living off of livestock or small family gardens. In terms of economy, you either see a generalized reciprocity or a redistribution. As political organizations, some achieved status among individuals, but nothing is permanent, right? There's no centralized leadership. Some examples of this would be the Sambia and the Yanomami. So this is showing you the Sambia of Southeast Asia and New Guinea. This is showing you a young Yanomami tribal member. So the Yanomami are actually kind of interesting, or the Yanomami, depending on how you pronounce them. You have completely decentralized leadership, right? You also have, each village has a big man, but that may shift. Actually, that may even shift so rapidly that in a given day, who's recognized as the big man may shift. Each Yanomami man is considered his own leader, right? So big men are used primarily to initiate hunts, right? So it's just a good example of that notion of episodic or informal leadership. If we look at chiefdoms, on the other hand, right, these are populations in the thousands. They live in permanent villages and hamlets. They're agriculturalists using crops or staple crops. They're centralized leadership under a paramount or top chief, right? The status, of course, is hereditary. The sons or daughters of the chief will become chief. An example of this would be the Trobriand Islanders as well as native Hawaiians. So the question really is like, how does this kind of notion of political power or the ability to become a leader within your culture really develop? You know, we went from being these kind of hunter-gatherer band-level societies all the way up to large, complex state-level societies with many, many layers of bureaucracy, right? So how does leadership form during all of those kind of constituent steps leading up to state-level society? Well, a political scientist called Robert Carnero kind of addressed this issue quite a bit. He called it aggrandizing, and he said this is how kind of your early chiefdoms developed. It's based on small groups with big man leadership, right? And essentially what he's saying is cooperative behavior and lineage coalition forming is essential to the formation of political groups, right? So the way you can kind of think about this is if you go to let's say I came into class one day and gave each one of you a cookie. I didn't ask for anything in return at the moment, and you know, you were all very happy that I gave you a cookie. But So that means that later on, let's say next week, I want to go and do a big hunt, but I need some people to come and help me. Well, the basic human psychology of it is that when I come to ask you to come and help me on that hunt, you're going to remember that cookie I gave you and be much more likely to help me in my hunt, right? So that's kind of that notion of aggrandizing. It's those small favors, those small ways in which you kind of endear other people to you, right? And that's what leads to the development of actual true leadership. So in terms of chiefdoms, the leader of a chiefdom is generally a true authority figure whose authority serves to unite members of the tribe in all affairs at all times, right? Chiefdoms have a recognized hierarchy consisting of major and minor authorities who control major and minor subdivisions within the culture. So although leaders of chiefdoms are almost always men, in some cultures a politically astute wife, sister, or single daughter of a deceased male chief could inherit such a powerful position as well. So this is just showing you some of the chiefdoms that existed in native North America right at the time that Europeans got here. One of the first Europeans to kind of explore North America was a guy named Hernando de Soto. And he was really in search of the Fountain of Youth, in which he never found. But in essence, he came across actually a whole host of chiefdoms, particularly up in the northern region near the Chiscas, that were actually women-run chiefdoms as well. So just showing you kind of the differences between bands and tribes versus chiefdoms and states in terms of notions on power, right? In bands and tribes, it's uncentralized, right? You're mainly running off of influence rather than power. There's small population size. You have a lot of decisions are made by consensus. There's a little more notions of egalitarianism. You have other reciprocity or gift giving, and you have foraging / horticulture as your means of subsistence. When we move into chiefdoms and state level societies, on the other hand, the power is centralized. You're ruling using power rather than just simply influence. They're larger population size, stratified on several different levels. With people at the top and people at the bottom. You have a redistribution of resources via tribute or progressive taxes or a market system, right? And your subsistence pattern, of course, is either agribusiness or small-scale agriculture. So let's look at and compare some chiefdoms that we see today. We have political and social organizations best really examined by using that comparative method, right? How do cultures organize themselves politically? And in smaller scale societies, chiefdoms, and downward to bands and tribal level societies, really that kind of organization is really revolves around kinship, right? So political complexity is not a function of population size, right? Because polities can be politically complex without having centralized leadership. If we look at one chiefdom that exists in modern day, we have the Trobriand Islanders, which are divided into districts, each island. Each district has its own chief, which was overlord to the headman from each village. So in essence, what we're seeing is each village within a district has a headman. The headman answers to the chief, which is the overlord of the district, right? What we see here is increasing centralization of political power over time, right? Chiefs are responsible for managing inter-district conflict, trade, and the chief can consent or deny any marriage within their district, right? So what you're seeing are several levels of complexity here in terms of political organization, right? You have the big men leadership down in the village level, but once you get to the district level, you actually have a paramount chief. So it's important to really understand that kind of difference between what we mean as a big man versus a chief, right? Big men positions are not heritable, whereas chiefdom positions are inheritable. Chiefs are found in rank-based societies where big men are found in more egalitarian or achieved status societies. So if we look at our state level societies, population sizes are generally in the hundreds of thousands to millions. There are permanent settlements in cities and villages. There's intensive agribusiness or agricultural complexes. There's complex economic trade systems as well as centralized political leadership with formal offices and bodies of power, right? Examples of this, of course, would be your state level societies like the United States, Greece, China, and if you want to go into the ancient past, even the ancient Maya were considered a state level society. Unfortunately, whereas Elman Service's schema kind of gives us a basic kind of framework by which to work off of when looking at how humans organize themselves. There are some problems with the schema, right? Many have criticized it as being far too simplistic, right? It acts as a good framework, but it is not an absolute across all societies for all of those categories, right? Today, anthropologists tend to approach political organization from Boasian historical particularism, right? Viewing each political system as the product of its own unique history. So in terms of political anthropology, really the question is how do anthropologists study political organization, right? Well, we focus on the real difference between power versus authority. Power is the ability to command others to action or compliance, and authority is centralized and institutionalized power to command others, right? So it's kind of like you can think about it as different layers, right? With power being kind of the very base layer, and once you get kind of these layers of bureaucracy in the centralization of that power, right? You have institutions that form around that power, things like lawmaking bodies and things like that that actually are given authority based on kind of cultural consent and agreement. So an example kind of would be a Yanomami headman holds a recognized position. He has power, right, in a given circumstance, but has no actual authority, right, because it's not a centralized or institutionalized power. So politics also plays a huge role in identities, right? Like many non-industrial societies, Micronesian cultures have dual political identities, right? Each member belongs to a familial lineage and then a clan lineage and as a member of the state, right? So essentially what we're looking at in kind of our modern landscape or our modern globalized landscape that we have today is a lot of these places have almost like this dual sovereignty, right? They have their kind of traditional political system that it used to exert power over their kind of villages and their kind of immediate living situation, but they're also existing inside these larger nation states that have more centralized authority, more centralized power. So if we look at kind of, so far when we talk about kind of tribes and bands and even once we get to chiefdoms, we start to really see the emergence of something called rank-based societies, right? These are societies that value prestige and status rather than raw wealth, right? Wealth may or may not in these societies be stratified, right? In ranked societies, we generally see a redistribution of wealth by those with the highest level of prestige. An example of this would be those plot latches that we talked about during the marriage ceremonies of the Guatemalan people of the Pacific Northwest. So when we look at these types of status, just be sure to know the difference between achieved versus ascribed status, right? With ascribed status, that's a social position allocated to an individual by society as a result of factors over which the individual has no control, right? Another way of looking at that is that status you are born with, right? Achieved status, on the other hand, is a social class position in which an individual acquires as a result of his or her own activities, right? That's something that can be achieved over the course of a given lifetime. So if we look at some of the aspects of state power, one of the early political anthropologists and kind of sociologists, Max Weber, looked at issues of state power and says that the state is the only one capable of legitimizing the use of force as well as monopolizing it. He referred to this as kind of the notion of hegemony or hegemonic power, right? It's the ability of a dominant group to create consent and agreement from a population of people without the use or threat of force, right? So in essence, their power is so complete, it's so absolute that they are no longer even questioned, right? They no longer have to even use threat or force in order to initiate action or change. Another aspect of state power is this notion of sovereignty, or the right to rule over, or the right to govern oneself. It's the right of a people to rule themselves as an autonomous political group. If we look at some examples, Native American groups in the U.S., like the Zuni, are still in legal battles to maintain their own sovereignty, which was actually guaranteed to them by treaties, right? If you take a history class, I don't have time to go over all of the specific treaties and the time periods, but there are a lot of Amerindian and Native American groups that are still today, technically and legally, according to those treaties, supposed to be afforded legal sovereignty over themselves, but is denied to them based off of some kind of treaty violations, as well as kind of the progress of society moving far beyond really dealing with things like that, small tribal sovereignties and the like. So if we look at another example, we have the Maasai people of Tanzania form non-government organizations to fight for sovereignty, right? The Maasai are fighting for economic independence and stability in the face of land loss to these larger African corporations that are coming in and taking their land. So many groups fighting for sovereignty today still exist within modern nation states, right? So these are groups of people that are part of their own distinct cultures, their own distinct political organizations, yet they're encompassed in the larger nation state, right? So the question really is do those people have the right to form their own sovereign states, right? To have their own notion of sovereignty. If we look at kind of an interesting case relating to sovereignty that happened within the U.S., we have the case of the Kennewick Man, which was a 9,000-year-old piece of human remains that was found in the banks of the Columbia River in Washington. The kind of final update happened in 2017 when the Kennewick Man's his remains were returned to the indigenous tribes. And really what happened here is there was a big debate over who owns the past, right? They found these skeletal remains. Scientists wanted to study them. And the indigenous people said, no, we would prefer if you just gave them the remains back to us and we could rebury them as we see fit. Well, because there was some distinct morphology and a little bit of a difference in the kind of cranial shape and size of the Kennewick Man, arguments were made that he actually was not, in fact, Native American, that he was a lost Russian trapper that kind of made it over to North America and died. Well, the issue really is who gets to determine whether or not someone's remains get to be used for scientific study if that consent was never given while the individual was alive. So the debate was essentially around the indigenous rights over the remains of their ancestors, and it spurred the passing of federal legislation in the early 90s called the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. So the Kennewick Man, in essence, highlights issues relating to Native sovereignty over archaeological remains, right? What happens when we dig up these ancient skeletons, right? Who owns them? Are they owned by the scientists who find them? Are they owned by the property owners, or are they owned by the descendants of those individuals? If we look at another form of kind of the manipulation of power within state-level societies, we have these non-state actors as well as non-government organizations, right? We've already seen some of the non-state actors who control international financial policies and development. These things are like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization. But we also have these non-governmental organizations, right? These are organizations that exist within a country that operate as a source of solidarity for specific interest groups within that particular state-level society. So if we look at kind of the spurring and the arrival of non-government organizations, a lot of them are actually in response to conflict and in response to kind of very distinct social pressures like food pressure, famine, disease, as well as violence, right? And violence is actually a topic which political anthropologists focus quite a bit on. Why do humans, if we have, when we talked about human origins, we talked about how our species has selected for cooperation with one another, right? So if we have this kind of evolutionary history of cooperation rather than competition with one another on a very kind of basic special animal level, why do humans commit violence to the degree that they do with each other, right? This is something that we refer to as the anthropology of violence, right? Some of our anthropologists study the processes behind violence, whether they're systemic or personal violence, right? Whether we're looking at militarization or conflict resolution as an area of focus, right? And we define militarization as the process through which a civil society organizes for production of military violence or warfare. And violence itself is actually pretty old in terms of our, intergroup conflict is pretty old in terms of our species, right? We even have as old as our Homo erectus and Neanderthals. As far as you can see on this Neanderthal skull cap, you could actually see a blunt force trauma wound, right? This is from when this individual was kind of clubbed on the side of the head, right? We even have instances where there's ritual violence where people's remains are being used to produce musical instruments. So in essence, the question is, well, why warfare? Well, obviously, we know based on modern society, it's not a very easily answered question, right? Warfare is conducted for various reasons cross-culturally. Like in Native North America, there are actually several different forms of ritualized warfare, right? In some cultures, it's not necessarily about diminishing the other group and conquering them. It's about regaining things like spiritual balance. Among the Dani of New Guinea, there's this notion of blood feuding, right? If some member of your tribe is killed, you are spiritually obligated to kill a member of the other opposing tribe, right? It's not even a matter of you killing the person responsible for murdering a member of your tribe. No, it's about spiritual balance. So you kill anyone, whether it's a man, woman, or child, does not matter. What you're looking to do is regain that balance, right? So there are different types of warfare conducted in different cultures. In terms of explanations for warfare overall, we've had a few different kind of theoretical swings in terms of how we've explained in major sciences why there is warfare. We have this socio-biological explanation that warfare is reproductively advantageous, right? Those who are able to commit warfare and those who are successful at warfare have a higher degree chance of acquiring more mates and becoming more successful and populating the planet more numerously. Napoleon Chagnon, the original anthropologist who worked amongst the Yanomami in Venezuela and Brazil, kind of noticed this. The men who are the best hunters, the men who are the fiercest warriors, actually had more wives and therefore fathered more children than those males who were not. So he was saying that, well, it's reproductively advantageous to be good at warfare. We also have this notion of the bottleneck theory, is that warlike societies occur wherever populations are bottlenecked, right? Think of Latin America, right? Even today, it's still a high degree of systemic violence, but even in the past, as we move to the ancient Maya, the ancient Aztec, those were very bloody warlike societies as well. We also have biological, right? That humans are, of course, naturally aggressive like our chimpanzee cousins. Unfortunately, this is not a very popular argument anymore because, well, it is really not very valid. What we really prefer is to look at this kind of anthropological explanation for warfare, that humans conduct warfare to maintain things like prestige and status, to maintain their own boundaries, and to expand and legitimize their own notions of power. So if we look at one example of this notion of prestige warfare, which is one of the kind of types of warfare that Native Americans practice in the New World, we have the kind of notion of counting coup, right? And counting coup was interesting. It wasn't necessarily killing the individual, right? These horse tribesmen of the Central Plains in the United States, people like the Lakota and the Blackfoot, as well as the Crow, in the Sioux, they would kind of have this kind of practice where you would ride up to your enemy, and the goal was to take your coup stick and whack them on the side or cause them a minor injury and get close enough to touch them without actually getting hurt yourself. So the goal wasn't really to even hurt them that much. It wasn't even really to kill them. It was to get close enough to that danger without actually getting hurt yourself, right? It was a symbol and a display, a performative act of bravery, right? And I throw this kind of picture up here because I want everyone to understand why people get so offended, or why Native Americans get so offended when they see non-Native people wearing headdresses, whether it's for a Halloween costume or it's for part of your outfit for Coachella or whatever. The issue is that those feathers that are on traditional Native American headdresses are all earned pieces of history, right? Let's say you see a feather with a red dot on it. That means you've killed an enemy. If you have a completely red feather, that means that you were wounded in your battle, right? If you have a split feather, that means you've been wounded many times and have survived, right? So there are different meanings behind each and every one of those feathers that's awarded in those headdresses. So when you see those headdresses that have those, several hundred feathers in there, you realize that that's a retelling of that individual person's life history, right? Their accomplishments, their prestige, right? Their status. So wearing something like that, it's basically like spitting on a sacred item. If we look at another type of Native American warfare, we have the notion of mourning war. This is where a raiding party is conducted to mourn the loss of a tribal member, right? They're usually seeking trophies such as severed fingers, ears, or arms, and I can attest to this on some of the archaeological digs I've worked on in northwestern Ohio from Native American groups about 1,000 years ago. I've dug up individuals who had 4 arms, and only 2 of them belonged to the person. So there was this kind of regular practice of collecting trophies, right? And this kind of notion of mourning war, this war done to mourn the loss of one of your tribal members, is not done, or it's not conducted to diminish the opposing group, but to regain spiritual balance. And this is done not in Native American groups, is done not just when the person dies or is killed by another tribe. It's just done when they die from disease or natural causes or etc. So one anthropologist that looked a lot at kind of warfare was Margaret Mead when she looked at Polynesian societies, and she worked to really debunk this kind of universal theory of imperative warfare that humans are driven to commit warfare amongst one another. So in essence, there's really no biological need for warfare. And she did this through looking at Polynesian conflict resolution, which didn't really involve, I mean, they prepared, got their weapons together, did all of the things that would like lead up to a war, but when they got to the actual battle, they would do something called a haka dance, which is this kind of elaborate kind of aggressive yelling and dancing. And sometimes if one group would not back down, then a battle may ensue. But for the most part, there was more of this ritualized dance that led to, more often than not, led to resolving the conflict, right? So what she was really saying is that depending on the culture, and really depending on the environment in which your culture is existing in, Polynesian cultures existing on small islands, really is going to determine how your notions of conflict resolution and warfare really persist within your culture. So if we look at state level societies in terms of power and violence, right, there is a fair degree of complexity behind state violence, right? It can either be complex or simple in terms of its intended goal. State violence can either target outsiders or minority groups within the state itself, right? And it can take several different forms. One that we're most familiar with, and one that's kind of operates in our own society, which is yet kind of hidden at the same time, is this notion of an industrial military complex. And it can be within the borders of the country or international, right? We could be seeking to commit state violence overseas with warfare, or you can be committing state violence at home with institutional persecution against certain minority groups. Just to kind of give you a brief explanation of what the military-industrial complex is, for those of you that aren't familiar with the term, it's this notion of the kind of revolving door that exists within American politics, where Congress uses tax funding through the Department of Defense to create tax-funded contracts or military defense contracts that go to large military contractors and all of the subsidiary corporations that belong to or kind of participate in producing weapons of war and kind of the technologies that go into sustaining our military. And those large military contractors in the form of corporations turn around and produce large-scale campaign contributions to the same members of Congress who vote to pass increases in military spending, right? So this is the kind of feedback loop that Dwight D. Eisenhower kind of warned us of when he left office in his famous speech to the UN, saying that we need to be very careful in this notion of creating a loop where we're feeding military funding or feeding tax-based funding into large corporations, which turn around and feed the money or some of the money back into Congress. It creates this kind of notion where it becomes advantageous for those congressmen to continue passing military budget increases, and the only way to continue to justify those military budget increases to the rest of the kind of populace of the state is to find a way in which to justify having military action in overseas places, whether saying that we are morally obligated to do so or whether using the military to protect corporate interest. So, kind of, if you prefer the more satirical end of it, this is the notion of kind of crony capitalism, right? Where the government pays the military protects commercial interests in various parts of the world, and those commercial interests turn around and reward the government by funding their political campaigns. So, kind of taking the line from, or a few lines from Dwight D. Eisenhower's famous speech to the UN, he says that every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in a final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone, right? It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children, right? So what Eisenhower was really saying here, and yes, you can make the argument that this was really said because they were during the height of the Cold War at the time, and there was large military ramping up in terms of arms manufacturing on both the United States and Russia. But what you can really say or glean from this is what he's saying is that the more money we spend on military production, the less money we have to spend on developing our own infrastructure, the less money we have to spend on social programs for our children. And more importantly, the more we use portions or sections or sectors of our society for military production, the less we are innovating, or the less we're using the genius of those sectors to innovate to building a better society. So if we look at an example of kind of state power or state violence that's kind of exerted in other areas, and kind of my case study I use is the kind of when I sarcastically say that the U.S. military is really use in modern times is really as a kind of corporate interest, or an army that protects corporate interest. We look at this Guatemalan Civil War, which occurred from 1940 to 1996, and we really say that 1940 really is kind of the early days when unrest started in the country. America really didn't get involved until about the mid 1950s. But anyways, the United States kind of caused the Civil War using Guatemala as a proxy war to combat communism. At least that's on the surface what you will read in history books that are written about this particular instance. In reality, though, when we look at kind of Freedom of Information Act records that have come out and kind of declassified files, the CIA, as well as right-wing groups within the country of Guatemala, deposed and murdered the democratically elected president in 1954, Jacobo Arbenz. And the American government claimed it was fighting communism under the justification of the Monroe Doctrine, but this really was only a superficial explanation. There was another reason why the United States was particularly so interested in Guatemala. So the reasoning behind, and this is why I say there was an alternative reason, we say on the surface we were using the Monroe Doctrine to justify our combating or preventing Guatemalan government from sliding into communism. Really what the issue was is that Arbenz was proposing to nationalize the farmland of the country and give the farmland back to the people who live in the country. At that point, a lot of the farmland in the country was owned by a place called the United Fruit Company, which was a United States produce producer, right? And the big kind of product that they were doing at the time was bananas. So in essence, the United Fruit Company was giving financial campaign donations to congressmen who are supporting these CIA programs to intervene in this kind of conflict down in Central America. So the United States and the CIA intervention kind of led to this notion of instability and unrest that occurred, this undulation between left wing to right wing that occurred over the next several decades that led to the deaths of millions of people. So another anthropologist who kind of looked at violence on a cultural level was Paul Farmer, and his kind of notion of the life of dangerous things, right? He examined the process by which arms are made, and he considered how many separate systems and people are involved in the manufacture, the sale, and the use of firearms, right? So Farmer believes in order to understand state violence, one must understand all of these different systems, all these different processes which are involved, right? So it highlights kind of the pervasiveness of violence within large-scale economic systems. So power is mobilized outside of the state in several distinct forms, right? We have initially agency, which is the power of an individual to contest cultural norms. We have social movements, which are collective group actions in response to injustice or inequality. And we have framing process, right? These are the processes by which shared meanings and motivations are created to justify social actions, right? So what we mean by power being mobilized outside of the state is not necessarily we're talking geographically outside of the state. We're talking how is power mobilized absent of your ability or your legitimacy that's afforded to you by the state. So we also have these rural movements, which are becoming more popular, right? There are currently numerous rural movements across Southeast Asia and Africa to adopt UN Resolution 763 on the rights of peasants working in rural areas, right? Asia, South America, Latin America, Western Europe have all ratified UN Resolution 763. The three countries who refuse are the United States, China, and Russia. And these are the three countries which use the most exploitative economic systems in terms of produce trade in other parts of the world. So, to kind of wrap things up here, be sure to review the case studies in the chapter, including those rural movements that occurred in Costa Rica and the Islamic Fatwa Council in Egypt. You also want to remember that services work is a good framework, but it's not absolute across all cultures. It provides us with a good schema to look at how humans organize themselves, but each of those categories is not mutually exclusive, right? No, thing is going to be definite through all categories, right? Humans, in essence, will organize themselves in many different ways, right? So be sure to review what political anthropologists like Paul Farmer and Andrew Bickford use as their framework of study.